Before my suitcases even stopped rocking on the wet pavement, I had already decided two things. I was not going to cry in front of the neighbors, and I was going to call the bank before I called my own son. That's who I am. That's who I have always been, even when the people who claim to love me forgot it. Whatever my son and his wife thought they knew about me when they packed my whole life into 4 suitcases and set them on the curb like yard sale leftovers, they were about to learn they didn't know the half of it. I stood there in a gray Arizona drizzle, staring at everything I owned, lined up like soldiers on a sidewalk in front of a house I had lived in for 31 years. A note was tucked under the handle of the biggest suitcase already going soft in the rain. I recognized the handwriting before I even unfolded it. Small, tight letters always underlined twice like she needed you to know she meant it. If you want to stay, we set up the garage for you. Winona, not Mom, not love you, just a name signed under an address that used to be mine. If you're watching this, and somebody in your own family has ever made you feel like a guest in your own life, stay with me because I promise you this story does not end on that sidewalk. I had flown home that morning after 2 weeks in North Carolina, helping my sister Denise get through hip replacement surgery. 14 days of hospital cafeteria coffee and a fold-out cot, and all I wanted on the drive home was my own bed, my own kitchen table, the porch light. My late husband and I wired ourselves the summer our son turned 12. That porch light was burning for somebody else's house now. My key didn't turn in the lock. They'd changed it and hadn't thought to mention it. I stood there a moment longer than I should have, one hand still resting on the cool metal of my suitcase handle, half expecting the door to open anyway, half expecting this to be some kind of misunderstanding I'd be laughing about by dinner. It wasn't. The porch swing Daniel had hung for me the year Cody left for college creaked once in the wind, empty, and I remember thinking almost foolishly that even the swing seemed to be waiting on somebody else now. The rain picked up while I stood there reading that note a second time, like the sky itself wanted to make sure I understood exactly how alone I was. 63 years old, soaked through, locked out of a house I helped build with my own 2 hands, and my first feeling, if I'm honest with you, wasn't grief. It was arithmetic. Because here's what my son and his wife did not know when they wrote that note and left me standing in the rain: I was still the one paying that mortgage. Every month like clockwork for 27 months running. $2,240 out of my account into theirs without either of them ever once asking where it came from. I pulled out my phone right there on the sidewalk and dialed Horizon Trust Bank. A woman with a kind, tired voice confirmed exactly what I already knew in my bones. The payment had cleared 4 days earlier, right on schedule, same as always. Thank you, I told her, and I meant it more than she will ever understand. Because somewhere between that phone call and the taxi driving past, slow enough for the driver to stare, I stopped being a woman who had just been thrown out of her own home. I became a woman with a plan. Let me back up. Because before you understand what it cost me to lose that house, you need to understand what it took to build it in the first place, and just how long I had quietly been holding it together. I grew up the third of 5 children in a 2-bedroom house in Memphis, where my mother cleaned houses on the west side of town, and my father drove a delivery truck for a bakery that's been closed for 30 years now. We didn't have money, but we had a saying in that house, one my mother repeated so often, it might as well have been carved over the door. Nobody hands you your dignity. You build it plank by plank, same as everything else worth having. I carried that saying with me the day I got on a bus to Arizona for my first teaching interview, and I carried it with me every day after, right up until the morning I found my bags on that sidewalk. I met Daniel Whitehorse 38 years ago at a fundraiser for the Tribal Youth Center outside Flagstaff. I had moved out from Memphis the year before, 25 years old, and 3 months into my first real teaching job, and I didn't know a single soul in that gymnasium, except the woman who'd invited me. Daniel was quiet in the way that makes you want to fill the silence around him, but when he did talk, people leaned in to listen. He built things for a living, cabinets, additions, whole porches, with a level he trusted more than most people trust their own eyes. I taught children how to read. Between the two of us, we didn't have much when we married the following spring. What we had was patience, a 5-year plan sketched on the back of a church bulletin, and a rocky half-acre lot on the edge of town that nobody else wanted because you couldn't grow a thing on it. We built our house ourselves. Not all at once, we couldn't have afforded that, but room by room over the better part of a decade. Daniel poured the foundation the summer before our son Cody was born. I hung the kitchen curtains myself, standing on a step stool, 8 months pregnant, because I could not stand to wait one more week for that kitchen to feel like mine. We put in the oak cabinets with our own hands the year Cody turned 6, sanding every one of them ourselves on the back porch until our arms ached. Every fixture, every shade of paint, every tree in that yard we chose it together, argued over some of it, and by the end loved every inch of it. I taught elementary school for 34 years, mostly second grade at the same school the entire time. By the time I retired, I had taught so many of this town's children to read that grown men would stop me in the grocery store to introduce me to their own kids. I want you to understand something plainly. A teacher's salary in this country does not build a house like the one I'm describing to you. What built that house was 2 people who never once in over 30 years together spent a dollar they hadn't already earned. Cody grew up watching that, or at least I believed he did. He was a sweet boy, asthma, something terrible until he was about 9, and I can still tell you exactly which nights I sat up with him in the rocking chair, listening to him wheeze, praying the inhaler would do its job before I had to make another emergency room drive. When it came time for college, Daniel's contracting business hit 2 rough years in a row. One commercial job fell through, then another, and for a stretch there we were stretched thinner than either of us wanted to admit out loud. I picked up a summer job grading standardized tests for the district, so Cody wouldn't have to take out loans. He never once asked me to do that. I did it because that is simply what you do for your child. Cody met Winona Little Elk his junior year at Northern Arizona University. She was sharp-tongued too in a way I mistook at first for confidence, rather than something a little less generous. Her family had run a small diner outside Tuba City for almost 20 years before it finally closed. Her younger brother Wade eventually opened his own place downtown, a barbecue restaurant. He was fiercely, almost defensively proud of the kind of pride that made you suspect the numbers behind it weren't quite as solid as the brisket. If you want to understand a family, don't watch how they act at Thanksgiving. Watch how they talk about money. Daniel and I built everything we had by never spending what we hadn't already earned, and we raised Cody the same way. Or so I thought. Cash envelopes for groceries when things were tight, a rule that whatever went on the credit card got paid off before the statement came no exceptions. But somewhere between his father's toolbox and his own downtown office job in commercial insurance, Cody developed a comfort with money that Daniel and I never had the luxury of. He didn't budget so much as assume things would work out the way people do when they've never once had to watch a payment bounce. Winona was different, not careless exactly, but hungry in a way that made me uneasy sometimes. She noticed things. Whose kitchen had been redone, whose car was newer, which of her old college friends had already moved into a house with a 3-car garage. I don't think she was a bad person for wanting more. I think she was a woman who measured her worth in square footage, and I understood that better than I let on, because grief had taught me my own hard lesson about what people mistake for security. Daniel passed 2 years and 8 months before that morning on the sidewalk. A heart attack sudden on a Tuesday while he was out measuring a fence line for a neighbor 2 streets over just as a favor. I won't pretend to you that I've made complete peace with how fast it happened. One morning we were arguing gently over coffee about whether the gutters needed cleaning before the fall rains came. By that evening I was a widow standing in my own kitchen, not knowing what to do with a second coffee mug. For the first 5 months afterward, I could barely function well enough to handle his estate, let alone think clearly about the house or the future. That's when Gerald Matthews, the attorney who had handled Daniel's business contracts for nearly 2 decades, sat me down in his office and told me gently that if I wanted to avoid a headache with inheritance tax down the road, the cleanest thing to do was transfer the deed to Cody now, while I was still living, and could manage the transition myself, rather than leave it tangled up in probate later after I was gone. I want to be honest with you about something. It made sense to me at the time. Grief makes you agreeable in ways that are hard to explain unless you've lived through it yourself. Cody was my only child. The house was going to be his someday, regardless of what I did. Signing it over early felt like a formality, not a surrender. So 27 months before that morning on the sidewalk, I signed the deed over to Cody and Winona. And that same week, without mentioning it to either of them, I set up an automatic transfer from my own account to cover the mortgage payment every month. I told myself it was temporary just until they got settled, just until Winona finished the medical billing certification she was working toward and started bringing in a full income of her own. I told myself a great many things during those months. Grief and love make excellent liars when they work together. What I refused to look at directly were the small signs that kept piling up quiet, as snow nobody bothers to shovel until the driveway is impassable. It started with comments. Winona mentioning more than once how much cleaner the front room would look without quite so many family photographs crowding the walls. Cody suggesting so casually I nearly missed it the first time that I might be happier somewhere with less upkeep, a phrase he used at least 4 separate times over 8 months, always in that same gentle, reasonable tone people use once they've already made up their mind about you and are only waiting for you to catch up. Then there was the Christmas I spent 10 days at Denise's in Charlotte and came home to find my reading chair moved down to the basement to make room for a treadmill. Nobody asked me first. Nobody mentioned it at all until I went looking for the chair and found the empty space where it used to sit. There was the afternoon I came home from a doctor's appointment to find Winona had reorganized my kitchen cabinets while I was out moving my grandmother's cast iron skillet up to a shelf I could barely reach on my tiptoes because it made more sense up there next to the other pans. Small, almost too small to say out loud without sounding petty. But small things stacked up patiently over 2 years build their own kind of wall. You just don't notice you're inside it until you go looking for the door. And then there was my granddaughter, Ayanna. 7 years old, all elbows and questions, the one relationship in that house I never once doubted, not for a single day. She had climbed into my lap on the porch swing one Sunday afternoon a few months back, legs swinging, and told me bright as anything that she was getting a way bigger room soon with a window seat in a new house her mommy had shown her pictures of on the tablet. I laughed it off at the time. Children talk about new bikes and new puppies and new houses the way adults talk about lottery tickets, pleasant daydreams, nothing more. I did not think not for 1 second that she was describing my house being sold out from under me before I had even finished unpacking from a trip to see my sister. I want you to hold on to that detail. We're going to come back to it. By the time I boarded the flight to North Carolina to help Denise through her surgery, I genuinely believed that whatever friction existed in that house was just the ordinary friction of 2 generations sharing walls and a kitchen. I believed I had given my son security the same way my own parents had given it to me, and that the security would come back around to me eventually in the currency. Families are supposed to trade in patience a little grace. The basic respect owed to a woman who had spent 34 years teaching other people's children and 38 loving her own family without ever once keeping score. I did not know that while I was spooning ice chips for my sister and reading her the newspaper out loud because her eyes were too tired for a screen, someone back home was already sitting across a desk from a realtor signing paperwork with my house's address printed at the top of the page. I didn't know it yet, but by the time that taxi pulled away from the curb, I was about to. A plan I would learn over the following weeks is not the same thing as knowing what to do next. Standing on that sidewalk with the bank representative's voice still fresh in my ear, all I actually had was a fact the money was still mine to control. Everything else, where I would sleep that night, what I would say to my son, how much of this I could survive, was still entirely unwritten. The plan didn't arrive all at once fully formed the way it might in a movie. It arrived in pieces, starting with the plain, practical fact that I could not stand on that sidewalk in the rain forever, and the garage door, I remembered, still opened on the same code it always had, Cody's birthday 0314. Some habits apparently hadn't been worth the trouble of changing. The door rattled up on its track, and for a moment I just stood there in the gray light taking it in. A twin mattress had been pushed against the far wall, a small nightstand and a cheap lamp beside it still wearing its price tag. My clothes hung on a portable garment rack, the kind you'd use for a garage sale. And stacked along the back wall, a dozen cardboard boxes sealed with packing tape, each one labeled in Winona's handwriting, Mom's stuff. Not Shannon's things. Not even Grandma's box. Mom's stuff like I was a category to be filed away, not a person who used to sleep 40 feet from where I was standing. I pulled the tape off the nearest box more out of reflex than curiosity, some old teacher's habit of needing to know exactly what I was dealing with before I could sit still. Inside my good kitchen towels were wrapped around Daniel's watch. His actual watch, the one with the cracked leather band he'd refused to replace for a decade, just dropped in loose among the linens like a stray button instead of the last thing that had ever touched my husband's wrist. I stood there holding it a long moment, turning it over, and I understood something in my chest before I understood it in my head. Whoever packed this box hadn't been cruel exactly. They had simply stopped considering at some point that any of it still mattered to somebody. I sat down on the edge of that mattress, the concrete floor cold under my feet, even through my shoes, and through the small window across from me, I could see the kitchen, my kitchen, or what used to be, lit up, warm and yellow against the gray afternoon. I had raised a son in that house. I had buried a husband in that house in the sense that matters, the sense of a man's last morning and his coffee mug, and the smell of his aftershave lingering in a closet I couldn't bring myself to empty for a year. And from a garage 40 feet away, apparently none of that added up to much of anything. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. A text from Cody. "Mom, we need the space. Winona's been asking for a home office for months, and the garage has everything you need for now. Please don't make this harder than it has to be. For now." As if this were a kindness with an expiration date I should be grateful for. I read it twice, my thumb hovering over the screen, and then I did something that would have shocked the woman I was even 1 week earlier. I put the phone down and didn't answer. Instead, I called Loretta. "Shannon," she said, and then hearing something in my voice she didn't like the sound of, dropped the teasing entirely. "Shannon, tell me exactly what's wrong." "They moved me to this garage," I said, and saying it out loud made it more real than reading Winona's handwriting ever could. "I'm sitting on a mattress in Cody's garage, Loretta. It's raining and I don't—" "I'm coming," she said, and I heard her keys already jangling in the background. 20 minutes. Don't you dare unpack a single thing in that garage, you hear me? Not one thing." She meant it half as a joke, but I didn't unpack anything, and when her ancient green pickup pulled into the driveway, 19 minutes later, I was standing at the end of it with my 4 suitcases, dry-eyed, looking at the house I'd raised my son in like it belonged to strangers, because as far as the law was concerned, it now did. Loretta didn't ask me anything in the driveway. She just got out, walked straight past me, and knocked on the front door. Winona answered. I couldn't hear what was said. I was already loading suitcases into the truck bed, but I watched Loretta's face do something I hadn't seen it do since we were 19 years old, and she was defending my honor against a girl who'd made fun of my thrift store coat. She came back to the truck with her jaw tight and didn't say another word until we were 3 streets away. "Frank's fixing up the back bedroom tonight," she said instead, eyes on the road. "You'll have your own bathroom, and Shannon, you stay as long as you need. I mean that." When we pulled into their driveway, Frank was already standing outside. He didn't ask a single question, just walked over, lifted the heaviest of my suitcases straight out of my hands and said, "Bathroom's got new towels. Loretta picked them up Tuesday." Tuesday, 2 full days before either of us had known I would need them. I didn't ask how she'd known something was coming before I did. Some friendships 30 years deep don't require the asking. I want to tell you I felt relief in that moment. Mostly what I felt was the particular humbling weight of being 63 years old and grateful for a guest bedroom. The first few days at Loretta and Frank's passed in a kind of fog. I slept more than I had in months. I ate meals I didn't taste. And more than once, lying awake in their spare room at 2 in the morning, I turned over a question that had no comfortable answer. Either way, had this been Winona's plan alone with Cody, simply too weak to stand against it? Or had my son sat across from me at Sunday dinner week after week, knowing exactly what was coming, and said nothing at all? I genuinely could not decide which possibility hurt worse. A son who'd been talked into betraying me, or a son who'd decided to on his own, and just hadn't found the nerve to say it to my face. I filed a change of address form with the post office almost as an afterthought, mostly so my medical bills and the AARP magazine I never asked for would find me. And I tried very hard not to think about the fact that I still hadn't canceled the automatic mortgage payment, that it was still sitting there in my account scheduled loyal dumber than I apparently was. It was the 5th morning at Loretta's when the mail came. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect a coupon circular a birthday card from a cousin in Georgia who didn't yet know what had happened a renewal notice for a magazine I never read. And underneath all of it, a plain white envelope from Horizon Trust Bank forwarded my name and Loretta's address typed neatly behind the little plastic window. I want you to understand something about how mortgages actually work because I didn't fully understand it myself until that morning, when Cody and Winona's names went on the deed to that house that changed who owned it. It did not change who owed the bank money for it. Nobody had ever refinanced that loan into their names. 27 months of automatic payments, later the mortgage note, the actual debt, the legal obligation still had exactly one name attached to it. Mine. I laughed when I understood it, a short, ugly sound with no humor in it at all. 2 years of paperwork, deed transfers, family meetings about protecting everyone's interests. And not one person in that entire process, not the attorney, not my son, not Winona with her spreadsheets, had ever walked the loan itself over into their own names. Maybe nobody had thought to. Or maybe someone had thought of it and simply hadn't wanted the bank running a joint credit check. I couldn't know which. I only knew what it meant for me, which is precisely why Horizon Trust Bank was required as a matter of standard policy to notify me the moment anyone requested a payoff statement against that loan. I read the notice standing at Loretta's kitchen counter, still in my robe, coffee going cold beside me. A payoff quote had been provided. The letter said to Canyon Title and Escrow in connection with a pending sale of the property at the request of the listing agent of Record Meridian Realty Group. And beneath that one line I read 3 times before the words rearranged themselves into something my mind could actually hold. Request date on file 3 months prior. 3 months. I sat down slowly at Loretta's table, that letter trembling faintly in my hand, and did the arithmetic I hadn't wanted to do. 3 months before that letter arrived was weeks before I had even boarded a plane to help my sister. Weeks before anyone had packed a single suitcase. They had not decided to sell my house the week I was away. They had decided months earlier while I was still living 40 feet from that garage. While I was still cooking Sunday dinner for all 4 of us. While I was still tucking Ayanna in on the nights her parents went out, still slipping $5 bills into her backpack for the ice cream truck, still believing, God help me, that I was loved in that house, and not merely tolerated until the paperwork caught up. I needed air. I walked out onto Loretta's back porch, still in my robe, the cold morning going straight through the thin fabric, and stood there with that letter in my hand until my breathing evened out enough to let me think instead of just feel. And that's when I thought of Ayanna on the porch swing back home months earlier, leg swinging, telling me she was getting a way bigger room soon with a window seat in a new house her mommy had shown her pictures of on the tablet. I had laughed it off as a child's daydream, the way children talk about new bikes and new puppies. It hadn't been a daydream. Somewhere out there was an actual house with an actual window seat that my 7-year-old granddaughter had already been shown while her grandmother was still hanging curtains in the only home she'd ever known, with no idea she was already being erased from the plans. I hadn't lost my home the morning I found my suitcases on the sidewalk. I'd lost it 3 months earlier in a conversation I was never invited to, and nobody had thought I deserved to know. I want to tell you something about grief because I think it gets misunderstood. People expect it to look like crying in the shower, or staring at old photographs, or not being able to get out of bed. Sometimes it looks like that. But there's another kind of grief, the kind that arrives already furious, that skips the soft stages entirely and goes straight to something harder, something with edges. That's the kind that found me on Loretta's back porch that morning, the payoff letter still warm from my own hands. I did not cry again after that morning. Not because I'd run out of tears, but because I'd found something more useful to do with the hours crying would have taken. I made a list. Not a to-do list exactly, more like a ledger, the kind Daniel used to keep for his jobs. 1 column for what I knew, 1 for what I needed to find out, and 1 the shortest column by far for what I was willing to let go. That last column stayed almost empty for a long time. For weeks, in fact, it held exactly 1 item, Ayanna. Whatever I decided to do about her parents, I promised myself at that kitchen table it would not touch her. Everything else I was willing to fight for, that I was only willing to protect. The first name on my need-to-find-out list wasn't Cody's or Winona's or even the bank's. It was Derek Nez. I hadn't seen Derek since he was 11 years old, sitting in the second row of my 5th grade classroom, chewing on his pencil eraser like it owed him money. He'd struggled with reading that year, not for lack of trying, but because nobody had caught until me that the words swam on the page for him in a way they didn't for the other kids. We worked through it together most lunch periods that spring, just the two of us, and a stack of books I'd chosen carefully. One level below, where his pride wanted him to be, one level above, where his fear had convinced him he belonged. Loretta was the one who remembered him. "Youngblood's nephew," she said, snapping her fingers over dinner 3 days after the letter came. "Little Derek, he does elder law now out of that office on Cedar Street. You taught that boy to read Shannon, don't tell me you forgot." I hadn't forgotten. I'd simply never expected to need him. His office was smaller than I pictured one paralegal, a waiting room with mismatched chairs, a coffee maker that had clearly seen better decades. But Derek himself, when he came out to greet me, stopped dead in the doorway, for a second something in his face doing a complicated thing between recognition and reckoning. "Mrs. Whitehorse," he said. "You probably don't remember, but book club Tuesdays and Thursdays, table by the window." I remembered sitting across from him now in his cramped little office the day he'd finally read a full paragraph out loud without stopping, how his ears had gone red with something between embarrassment and pride, how the whole class had clapped without me even asking them to. I hadn't thought about that moment in probably 15 years. It came back whole unbidden the way the important ones always do. You went from a boy who wouldn't read out loud in front of the class to the top reading group by May. Of course I remember. He didn't charge me for that first consultation. He didn't charge me for any of them. In the end, though, it took me weeks to accept that gracefully, instead of arguing about it every single visit. I laid out everything for him. The deed transfer, the 27 months of payments, the letter from Horizon Trust, all of it. He listened without interrupting the way good listeners do, taking notes only when something made his pen stop moving entirely. "Here's what I want you to understand first," he said when I finished. "You are still right now today the sole obligor on that mortgage note. That's not a technicality. It means the bank answers to you, not to them. You can instruct them to halt any further release of information to that title company. You can, if you choose, simply stop paying, and there is very little your son and daughter-in-law can do about that, except panic, which candidly might be useful to us." "Useful how?" "People who are panicking," Derek said, "make mistakes, and mistakes leave paper trails." I didn't know yet how right he'd turn out to be. The mistake, as it happened, arrived through the most unremarkable channel imaginable, Loretta's hair appointment. She came home on a Thursday with fresh highlights and an expression I'd learned over 30 years of friendship to recognize as her "I heard something" face. "Teresa Ramirez does both my hair and Winona's," she said, dropping her purse on the kitchen table like it had personally wronged her. "Has for years. And apparently sitting in that chair, a woman will say things she'd never say sober in daylight to another human being." Loretta. "Wade's restaurant is going under Shannon. Behind on rent, 2 months supplier threatening to cut him off, the whole thing. And Teresa says Winona's been beside herself about it, not just worried sister beside herself. We already told him we'd help beside herself." I set down the mug I'd been drying. "Help how?" $80,000, Loretta said. "Out of the house sale. Cody and Winona already promised Wade $80,000 to save that restaurant the moment the sale closed. Teresa didn't know I'd care one way or another. She was just talking the way people do. But I sat in that chair. Shannon and I thought about you on that garage mattress, and I could have put my fist through the mirror. I want to tell you my first feeling was rage. It wasn't or not only. My first feeling, God forgive me, was something closer to relief. The strange backwards relief of finally understanding a shape that had only made sense as a monster before I saw its edges clearly. Because here is what that $80,000 told me once I sat with it. This wasn't only greed. Greed alone, I think I could have almost forgiven people want bigger houses that's simply human. But desperation is a different animal entirely. If Cody and Winona had already made a promise to Wade, They couldn't keep any other way if the restaurant was truly circling the drain, and Winona's own family stood to lose everything. Without that sale closing on schedule, then I wasn't dealing with two people casually discarding an inconvenient old woman. I was dealing with two people who believed rightly or wrongly that saving one family required sacrificing another. And I understood with a clarity that honestly frightened me a little that they had simply decided which family I belonged to. It also told me something more immediately useful: they needed that closing date. Badly, and soon. Which meant every day I delayed every day their payoff request sat unanswered while I quietly decided what to do next wasn't just an inconvenience to them. It was a countdown. I thought about my mother that evening, the one who used to tell me nobody hands you your dignity, you build it plank by plank. She never said anything about what happens when somebody tries to trade yours away to save somebody else's. I don't think she'd lived long enough to imagine a family capable of doing both at once, loving you in their limited fashion, and still deciding you were the more affordable thing to lose. I went to see the bank in person the following week, mostly because Derek suggested it would look better on record a borrower actively engaging with her loan, not hiding from it. The man behind the desk introduced himself as Wesley Begay, and something about him unhurried, careful with his words, the way Daniel used to be, put me at ease almost immediately. I processed that payoff request myself. He told me once I explained why I'd come. I want to be careful here, Mrs. Whitehorse, because I can't give you legal advice, and I won't pretend to. But I've worked this branch 9 years, and I don't often see a note holder with 27 months of flawless payments who isn't also the one living in the property. He paused, choosing his next words the way a man chooses a board at a lumberyard, checking it for warp before he commits to it. If I were you, I might ask a lawyer what the word equitable means in this context. That's all I'll say on it. It was exactly what Derek needed to hear, and exactly what I needed to hear said out loud by someone with no reason to say it, except decency. Over the following 10 days, I became a woman with a filing system. I want you to understand what that actually looked like, because I think people romanticize the word evidence until they've had to assemble it at a kitchen table at 11 at night. 27 months of bank statements printed and highlighted. The original contractor's invoice from when Daniel and I redid the bathroom plumbing 4 years before he died, in both our names. Photographs, actual photographs, the kind you print at a drugstore kiosk of the new roof we'd put on the year before Cody left for college, of the kitchen renovation, of every improvement that had gone into that house on our dime and nobody else's. Derek called it a paper trail. I called it 38 years of my life, laid out in manila folders organized by date, because that's what a woman does with grief when she refuses to let it just sit there and rot. I kept a normal face through all of it. Cody tried twice that week. Once a call I let go to voicemail, his message clipped and tense, something about needing to move forward. Once a text asking if we could just talk, no pressure. I answered neither right away. I want to be honest with you. Some small, tired part of me still wanted to call him back and fix it the old way, the way I'd fixed every scraped knee and broken heart of his childhood. I didn't let myself. Some wounds, I was learning, only heal if you stop touching them before they're ready. When I finally did answer him, it was 3 words and nothing more. I'm thinking about it. Not a lie exactly, just not the whole truth. The HELOC turned up by accident, the way the most important things usually do. Derek had asked me to bring in anything else related to the house, any old paperwork Daniel might have kept, so I spent an evening at Loretta's kitchen table going through the last box of his files I hadn't been able to face sorting since the funeral. Tax returns, warranty cards for appliances that had long since died, and near the bottom a slim folder labeled in Daniel's blunt contractor's handwriting, garage workshop. 8 years before he died, we'd taken out a home equity line of credit, $16,000. Both our names on it to convert half the garage into a proper workshop for his business. Ductwork insulation, a real concrete floor poured over the old cracked one. I remembered the project. I did not remember until that folder was open in front of me that we'd never fully paid it off. $6,000 in change sitting there ever since quietly accruing minimum payments I'd apparently folded into the general household budget without ever consciously registering it as a separate debt. I brought the folder to Derek the next morning more out of thoroughness than hope. He went very still reading it the way he had that first day in his office, and when he looked up, there was something almost like admiration in his expression, though I hadn't done anything except fail to throw away an old file. "Mrs. Whitehorse," he said, "do you know if this was ever formally released when the deed transferred?" I didn't, of course. Neither, it turned out, 2 phone calls later did the county recorder's office, Gerald Matthews' old firm, or anyone else who should have caught it. A second lien still technically attached to that property, still in the names of Shannon and Daniel Whitehorse, that nobody not the attorney who'd rushed the deed transfer through in my grief, not the title company now trying to close a sale, had noticed or cleared. "This changes things," Derek said. "Not because of the money. $6,000 isn't going to make or break anyone, but it means that title isn't as clean as your son and daughter-in-law think it is. It means technically they can't deliver clear title to a buyer without you. Without me signing off." "Without you signing off," he agreed. "On 2 separate documents now, not one. Mrs. Whitehorse, I have to say it for a woman who claims she doesn't understand any of this. You have accidentally built yourself a remarkably strong hand." "I didn't build it," I said. "I just never threw it away." The call came on a Tuesday while I was helping Loretta weed her tomato beds, both of us on our knees in the dirt, the way we'd been at various points for 30 years of friendship. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway, old habit, in case it was a former student's parent or the school calling about something. "Mrs. Whitehorse, my name is Patricia Alonzo. I'm calling from Adult Protective Services for the county. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. I received a report expressing some concern about your welfare, and I just wanted to check in, ask a few questions, make sure everything's all right." I sat back on my heels in that garden dirt and felt something cold settle into my stomach that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What kind of concern?" I said. Not a question, really. A demand dressed up as one. She was careful professional, clearly trained not to alarm people, which only alarmed me more. Something about a family member noting some recent decisions that seemed out of character. Something about wanting to confirm I understood the financial choices I'd been making. Something about whether I felt safe, whether anyone was pressuring me, whether I might benefit from a wellness visit. I answered every question calmly. I have spent 34 years being calm in rooms full of 8-year-olds having the worst days of their small lives. I was not going to lose that particular skill in front of a stranger on the phone, no matter how badly I wanted to scream. But when I hung up, I sat there in Loretta's tomato bed with dirt under my fingernails and understood with a clarity that made my hands shake exactly what had just happened. They hadn't called to ask if I was safe. They'd called to build a record that could say later in a room with lawyers that Shannon Whitehorse's family had grown concerned about her mental state right around the time she started making unusual financial decisions. It didn't matter whether it worked. It only mattered that it existed. I had built an entire career on the assumption that my judgment could be trusted with other people's most precious possessions, their children, 6 hours a day, 34 years running. And now, apparently, 2 phone calls and a vague report were enough to put my own judgment up for review. I called Derek before I'd even finished brushing the dirt off my knees. He didn't waste time being outraged on my behalf, which I appreciated more than I could say in that moment. He moved. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, he'd gotten Dr. Reyes, my doctor, for 11 years, the woman who'd seen me through Daniel's death, and 100 ordinary appointments before that, to write a formal letter confirming in the plainest clinical language available that I was of sound mind, fully oriented, and entirely capable of managing my own financial and legal affairs. By the next morning, that letter was in the county's file and Derek's file, and in mine. I want to tell you the anger came later that night once the adrenaline wore off and I was alone in Loretta's guest room in the dark. But that's not quite true. The anger was there the whole time underneath the calm, the way a foundation sits underneath a house you can't see from the street. They had tried to take the one thing I'd never once in 63 years allowed anyone to question, my mind. And in trying, they had shown me with a clarity no amount of gentle phone calls or reasonable text messages ever could have exactly how far they were willing to go to get what they wanted. I went back inside Loretta's house that evening, washed the garden dirt from under my fingernails, and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a long moment, really looked the way you do when you need to confirm you're still the person you think you are. I was. I was just done being quiet about it. Being done with quiet, it turned out, didn't look like one dramatic moment. It looked like a series of small, deliberate actions, one after another. Derek finished preparing the equitable interest filing on a Monday, walking me through each page at his cramped conference table before either of us signed anything. "I'll hold submission until Thursday morning," he said, "before whatever meeting comes next. That way, when you tell them, it won't land as a threat. It'll already be true." "Good," I said and signed where he pointed. I want you to understand that I didn't feel powerful signing that document. I felt like a woman finally putting something down that she'd been carrying in the wrong hands for far too long. Cody called on a Tuesday morning, and this time I answered. "Mom." His voice had a rawness I hadn't heard from him in years, not since he was a teenager. "We have a buyer. A great offer, full price, everything. They want to close in 45 days. Mom, please, whatever's going on with you and the mortgage. Some woman from the bank tried explaining it to Winona, and it didn't make sense to either of us. Can we please just fix it? Can we talk?" There was real fear in his voice, not just frustration, and for just a moment, I let myself remember every single time in his childhood I'd rushed toward that particular tone. A scraped knee, a bad dream, the asthma attacks that used to wake the whole house. My body still wanted to fix it. 33 years doesn't unlearn itself in 8 weeks, no matter how justified the unlearning might be. I could have told him everything right there on the phone. Derek had in fact advised against it. Some conversations he'd told me the week before with the particular flatness of a man who'd learned that lesson the hard way. Go better in a room where everyone has to sit still and listen to the whole thing before they're allowed to react. So instead I said, "I'll meet you Thursday at my attorney's office." The silence on the other end of that call told me everything about how those 2 words my attorney had landed. I spent the 2 days before that meeting the way I imagine soldiers spend the night before a battle they've already decided to win, not calm exactly, but purposeful. Derek walked me through what to expect, what not to volunteer, when to let silence do the talking. Loretta pressed my good Navy dress for me without being asked the one I'd worn to Daniel's retirement dinner from the county the year before he died. "You're not just going to that office as yourself," she said, smoothing the collar. "You're going as everything they forgot you were." I looked at myself in Loretta's hallway mirror before we left a 63-year-old woman in a Navy dress older than her son's marriage, dry-eyed, steady-handed, and for the first time in 2 months, I recognized exactly who was looking back. Derek's paralegal showed Cody and Winona into the small conference room where I was already seated, and I watched both of them clock in the same half-second the folder in front of me, thick-tabbed official, and the fact that I hadn't stood up to greet them. Winona had dressed sharply the way she always did for anything she considered a performance. Cody looked like he hadn't slept. Winona spoke first before anyone had even fully sat down. "I want to say for the record that we're here in good faith. We're hoping we can resolve this like adults. I'd hoped for the same thing 2 months ago," I said, standing in the rain outside my own house. "But please go ahead." Cody flinched. Winona didn't. "You stopped the payments," Winona said. "Which is your right legally, I suppose. But I think you need to understand something, Shannon. This house, I know it's hard. I know you raised your family here, but it's not yours. It hasn't been for 2 years. Whatever you think you're owed, you agreed to give up the day you signed those papers." I let the silence sit there a moment before I answered, mostly because Derek had taught me over these last hard weeks that silence does work, anger never could. "I signed over a deed," I finally said. "I never signed away a debt. As of 9 o'clock this morning, the county recorder's office has a filed notice of my equitable interest in that property based on 27 months of mortgage payments made from my own account after the transfer. And somewhere in a filing cabinet at Horizon Trust Bank sits a home equity line still active, still carrying both my name and your father-in-law's, that nobody released when that deed changed hands. Your title isn't clean, Winona. It hasn't been clean for 2 years. You simply didn't know it until about 90 seconds ago." Derek slid a copy of the recorded notice across the table, along with photocopies of the old HELOC documents, letting the paper do work that words alone couldn't. I watched something happen behind Winona's eyes that I can only describe as a woman doing very fast, very unwelcome arithmetic. "What do you want?" Winona said, her voice shifting into something flatter, more businesslike, the sound of a negotiation being recalculated in real time. A percentage of the sale once it closes. We could work something out. 15, 20,000 and you sign whatever release Derek wants to draft and everyone moves forward. I almost laughed. Not because the number insulted me, though it did, but because it told me more clearly than anything else in that room that she still didn't understand what any of this had ever actually been about. I don't want $20,000, Winona, I said. I want the truth acknowledged out loud in this room that what happened to me on that sidewalk was not a housekeeping decision. It was a choice the two of you made, and I am not for sale at any number that lets you avoid saying so. Cody, who'd been quiet through most of this, finally spoke, and his voice had the particular crack in it I remembered from every hard conversation of his childhood. Mom, please, if this falls apart, we lose everything. I don't even know what that does to us, to you, seeing Ayanna to any of it. It wasn't quite a threat. It also wasn't quite not one, and we both knew which side of that line he was standing closer to. For one long moment, something in me wanted to fold completely the way it always had, the way 33 years of loving that boy had trained me to. I thought of that list at Loretta's kitchen table, the nearly empty column, the single name written inside it. And then I thought he is using the very thing I promised myself I would protect as a lever to make me smaller. That more than anything else in that office told me I was doing exactly the right thing. Don't, I said, quiet but absolutely steady. Don't you dare use that little girl to get what you want from me. I have never once in 7 years made Ayanna a bargaining chip. I am not going to let you turn her into one now in front of me and pretend I won't notice what you're doing. Cody's face went through something complicated, shame maybe, or the beginning of it, though it would take a good deal longer than that afternoon for it to fully arrive. He didn't look at Winona. He looked at his own hands folded on the conference table, like a boy waiting to be excused from the principal's office. And for just a moment, I saw exactly the child I'd raised lost somewhere inside the man sitting across from me. They left without agreeing to anything, without apologizing, without much of anything at all except a promise from Winona, tight voice, that they'd have their own attorney look into it. I didn't doubt they would. I doubted very much it would change what Derek had already filed. Derek walked me out to Loretta's truck afterward, and for the first time since I'd met him as a grown man instead of a boy with a pencil eraser between his teeth, he looked at me with something other than professional composure. "Mrs. Whitehorse," he said. "For what it's worth, I don't think I've ever seen anyone hold a room like that on their first try." "I've had 34 years of practice holding rooms," I told him. "They just usually had smaller chairs." He laughed, actually laughed right there in the parking lot. And it was the first time in 2 months I'd made anyone laugh instead of wince. 6 days. That's how long it took. I won't pretend those 6 days were easy. There was a night, the 4th one, I think, when I lay awake in Loretta's guest room doing the math on everything I stood to lose if this didn't work. My credit, certainly. Possibly the house outright if some judge decided my equitable interest theory was creative lawyering and nothing more. Possibly in the worst version of that 3 a.m. arithmetic, my relationship with Cody forever, regardless of how any of it turned out. I got up, made tea, I never drank, and sat at that kitchen table until the sky started going gray, and by morning I had talked myself back into the only certainty I still trusted completely. Whatever I lost, I would not lose it by staying quiet. I thought, too, about what it would mean for Ayanna someday to learn the whole shape of this story. Not the sanitized version her parents might tell her, but the real one with the garage and the mattress and a stranger's phone call, asking whether her grandmother was safe in her own mind. I decided somewhere around 5 that morning that I wanted her to inherit a grandmother who had stood up whatever the cost, rather than one who had simply quietly disappeared into a spare bedroom for the rest of her life. On the 3rd day, to my genuine surprise, Cody texted asking if I wanted to talk to Ayanna on the phone. I said yes before I'd even finished reading the question twice. She told me in the breathless, tumbling way 7-year-olds tell you anything about a spelling test she'd aced, and a friend named Ruby who had a new puppy, and absolutely nothing at all about houses or moves or window seats, because as far as Ayanna knew, none of that had anything to do with her. "When are you coming to see me, Grandma?" she asked somewhere near the end, and I had to sit very still on Loretta's porch swing a moment before I could answer. "Soon, baby," I said. "I promise you soon." I meant it more than I'd meant almost anything else in 2 months. Whatever else was about to happen with the county recorder or canyon title or anyone else deciding this from the outside, that promise was the one thing in the entire mess I intended to keep no matter what. Derek called on a Wednesday afternoon, and I could hear, even before he said a single word, that this call was different from the others. "It's over," he said. "The buyers withdrew this morning. Canyon Title flagged both the equitable interest filing and the old HELOC as unresolved defects on the title, and apparently the buyer's own lender wouldn't fund a mortgage against a property that wasn't clean." Their attorney called Winona directly to break the news, and from what I gathered secondhand, it wasn't a calm conversation. 45 days from offer to closing, and it collapsed 6 days before signing. I sat down slowly at Loretta's kitchen table, the same table where I'd read that first letter what felt like a lifetime ago. "There's more," Derek said, and something in his voice made me brace myself before he'd even continued. I heard it secondhand from a colleague who handles the other side of these things. Cody and Winona were already under contract themselves, a new build-out in a development called Brightwater Estates, contingent on this sale closing, which means they just lost that house too. I finished for him. I thought absurdly of Ayanna on that porch swing, leg swinging, telling me about a bigger room with a window seat, a new house her mommy had shown her on a tablet. I thought about how certain she'd sounded, how certain her parents must have been to promise a 7-year-old a room that specific that detailed before a single paper was ever fully signed. I called Loretta in from the garden to tell her. She didn't cheer exactly. She just set down her trowel, walked over, and hugged me hard enough that I felt it in my back teeth. "It's not over," she said into my shoulder, which was exactly the right thing to say because it wasn't, and we both knew it. That evening, Frank grilled steaks he'd apparently been saving for an occasion he wouldn't specify, and the 3 of us ate on the back porch as the sun went down, not celebrating exactly, but allowing ourselves for one evening to simply breathe. I want to tell you I felt triumphant. Mostly what I felt was tired and something close to grief all over again, not for the house, not even for Cody and Winona's collapsed plans, but for a 7-year-old girl who was about to lose a window seat she'd never even gotten to sit in for reasons she would never fully understand. But underneath that quiet and certain as a foundation poured decades ago was something else. They had run out of moves. I hadn't. I thought about the deed sitting in a drawer somewhere in that house, about a mortgage note that had faithfully carried my name for 27 months, about a HELOC nobody had bothered to close out in over a decade. Every piece of paper I had quietly, faithfully generated across 38 years, it turned out, had been building toward this exact moment without my ever once intending it to. The next call I already knew would not come from Derek or Loretta or Patricia Alonso or anyone else standing at the edges of this thing. It would come from Cody, and this time I intended to be the one setting the terms. Cody called 4 times in 2 days after the sale collapsed. I let 3 of them go to voicemail, not out of spite, but because Derek had taught me that whoever speaks first in a negotiation usually loses something, and I intended to lose nothing else. On the 5th call I picked up. The voicemails had told their own story if you listened closely. The first clipped informal asking if we could discuss next steps. The second 3 hours later less formal, the word please appearing twice. The third came at 11 that night. And underneath the words themselves, I could hear something that sounded almost like fear, not of losing the house, I think, but of losing the version of himself that still believed he hadn't really done anything so terrible. "We need to meet," he said. And for the first time in this entire ordeal, I heard something in his voice I hadn't heard since he was a boy, asking me to fix something he already knew was broken beyond a simple fix. "Please, Mom, just you, me, and Winona. Derek's office, if that's what makes you comfortable." It was. I didn't need Loretta to press address for me this time. I didn't need a pep talk in a hallway mirror. Whatever transformation I'd gone through over those 2 months had apparently finished happening somewhere along the way, quietly, without an announcement, the way most real changes do. They arrived Monday morning looking like 2 people who hadn't slept in the 6 days since the buyers walked away, which I'd later learn was close to true. Brightwater Estates had gone to another buyer that same week. Wade's restaurant would close its doors 12 days later, the $80,000 that never came arriving 4 months too late to matter. I had exactly one condition, and I'd written it down the night before so I wouldn't soften it in the moment. "I'll release the equitable interest filing," I said. "I'll release the HELOC. I'll sign whatever Derek needs me to sign to make your title clean again. In exchange, you sell me the house at exactly the remaining loan balance. Not market value, not one penny toward what either of you imagined you'd walk away with." For a moment, neither of them said anything at all. I watched Winona's eyes flick toward Cody, then toward Derek, then back to me, running some calculation I couldn't see the inputs for only the result flickering across her face. Cody's mouth actually fell open. "Mom, that house is worth 3 times that. Maybe more. It's worth exactly what I put into it over 27 months, I said. Not $1 of yours, not $1 of Winona's. You're welcome to find another buyer who'll pay market value for a property with 2 unresolved liens on it, and a mother-in-law who has already demonstrated in writing exactly how far she's willing to go to protect her interest in it. I suspect that buyer will be harder to find than you think." Winona, to her credit, was the one who spoke first this time. "Cody, we don't have a choice here. You know we don't." He knew. I watched him know it the same way I'd watched him understand at 7 years old that a broken toy sometimes just stays broken no matter how badly you want to fix it before bedtime. There was no apology in Winona's voice, not yet. Maybe not ever, but there was something else underneath it, something almost like respect, grudging and unpracticed. "You planned all of this," she said to me, not quite a question. "I didn't plan any of it," I said. "I only refuse to disappear quietly. There's a difference even if it doesn't always look like one from where you're sitting." "Before we sign anything," I said because I'd promised myself I would say this, and I intended to keep that promise same as any other, "I want you to say it. Out loud. What you did calling that woman from Adult Protective Services, letting people believe I wasn't in my right mind because I'd finally stopped being convenient." The silence stretched long enough that Derek shifted in his seat. "That was me," Cody said, finally quiet, not looking at Winona. "Winona didn't know until after. I panicked. I thought if I could just, I don't even know what I thought I was doing. I'm sorry, Mom. That one I already know exactly how wrong it was. I don't need you to tell me." His eyes were wet when he said it, and some old stubborn part of me, the part that had rocked him through asthma attacks at 3 in the morning, wanted badly to tell him it was all right. It wasn't all right. I let the silence hold both of those things at once because I was learning slowly that a thing can be forgiven someday and still not be all right today, and both of those can be true without canceling each other out. It wasn't the whole apology I might have wanted if I'd let myself want one, but it was true, and it was his freely given instead of extracted, and after everything that counted for something. We didn't hug. We didn't cry together, not in that room. But something in the air between us had shifted 1/2 degree off the course. It had been running for 2 months and 1/2 degree. I was learning can be the beginning of an entirely different direction if you give it enough time and distance to travel. We signed the papers 11 days later in the same conference room with considerably less ceremony than either of us probably expected the moment to have. Ayanna wasn't there. Winona had left her with a sitter, but I found myself thinking of her anyway, signing my name on page after page, imagining some future version of her old enough to understand what these documents actually meant, hoping she'd read them someday not as the record of a family fracturing, but as proof that her grandmother had refused to vanish quietly. I want to tell you it felt like winning. Mostly it felt like exhaling after holding my breath for 2 months straight. I didn't take that house back to beat my son. I took it back so I would never again have to ask anyone's permission to matter in my own life. The first night back in that house, I didn't sleep, but not for the reasons you might expect. I walked from room to room in the dark, the way you do when you're confirming something is real, touching door frames and light switches, like a woman checking she hadn't dreamed her own life back into existence. Winona had painted over the warm yellows I'd chosen 30 years earlier with a cool, fashionable gray that I ended up, to my own surprise, mostly leaving alone. It wasn't mine, but it wasn't unkind either, and I'd spent enough of the last 2 months fighting over things that actually mattered. I put my own photographs back on the mantel. I hung Daniel's old level, the one he trusted more than his own eyes, on a nail in the garage. The same garage, though I'd had the mattress and the boxes cleared out within the first week, replaced at last with the workshop it was always meant to be. Wade's restaurant closed for good that November. I won't pretend I felt nothing at all about that. Desperation had driven a good deal of what happened to me, and desperation rarely disappears just because a villain's plan falls apart. Quietly, without telling Cody or Winona, I helped him put a down payment on a second-hand food truck instead. He named it after his mother. I still don't know if Winona knows I did that, and I've decided I don't need her to. Cody came by on a Sunday in October, Ayana's hand in his, a wrapped casserole dish balanced awkwardly against one hip like a peace offering he wasn't entirely sure would be accepted. It was accepted. Over coffee, careful, and a little formal with each other in a way we'd never quite been before he told me Winona was pregnant again, a girl due in January. "We wanted you to be one of the first to know," he said, and I let myself believe that was true, mostly because I needed to. "We are not? I should tell you honestly all the way back to where we were. I don't know if we ever will be, and I've stopped needing us to be, which is its own kind of healing nobody warns you about. But he visits now. He asks questions instead of announcing decisions. Last week, unprompted, he asked what I thought about a paint color for the nursery, actually waited for my answer, and wrote it down. The following week, Derek helped me open 2 education accounts, one for Ayana, one for the baby on the way. Neither can be touched by anyone but the children themselves, and not until they turn 18. I updated my own will that same week with almost identical language, so that whatever I have left when I'm finally gone goes toward the same purpose. I did not spend a single dollar of what I'd fought for on anything for myself. It was never about the money, and spending it on my own comfort would have made it feel retroactively like it had been. On the first truly warm evening of spring, I had everyone who'd carried me through this over to the backyard Daniel and I built with our own hands. Loretta and Frank Derek Wesley Begay, and his husband, 2 former students who still call me Mrs. Whitehorse, decades later. Ayana ran through the sprinkler in the side yard, well past her bedtime, shrieking with the specific delight of a child who has no idea any of this was ever in question, and watching her, I understood that maybe that had been the whole point of everything I'd done. Not the house itself, but making sure she never had to know a version of her family where her grandmother simply disappeared. We ate too much and stayed too late, and nobody once mentioned mortgages, liens, or square footage. My son took my house, but in trying to take it, he gave me back something he never intended to, myself. I think about what I'd tell any woman watching this, who recognizes even a little of herself in my story, the one quietly paying a bill. Nobody thanks her for the one who's learned to make herself smaller, so the peace holds one more day. Here is what I know now that I wish I'd known, standing in the rain with 4 suitcases. Love and self-respect were never supposed to be a trade. You do not have to choose between being generous and being protected. I spent 2 years believing that keeping the peace meant staying quiet, and all it actually bought me was a mattress in a garage. Trust your family. I still do more than this story might suggest. But trust doesn't mean handing over every piece of paper with your name on it and hoping decency fills in the rest afterward. Keep your name on what's yours. Keep records. Keep a lawyer's number in your phone before you ever think you'll need one. Dignity, my mother told me a long time before any of this happened, isn't something anyone can hand you. You build it plank by plank, the same as anything else worth having, and you don't stop building just because you're tired or grieving or 63 years old and afraid of ending up alone. And if you ever find yourself standing where I once stood, I want you to remember what actually carried me through it. It wasn't anger. Anger burns fast and leaves you with nothing but ash and a bad night's sleep. It was clarity, knowing exactly what was mine, what I had earned, and what I refused to lose, that walked me all the way back through my own front door. You are allowed to love people and still hold your ground. Those were never opposites, no matter what anyone tells you. Nobody told me that in time to spare me the sidewalk. I'm telling you now, so it doesn't have to be your sidewalk, too.